between 1525 and 1866. In the entire history of the slave trade to the New World, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, and South America.
My name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week, I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? All right, and welcome back to another episode of How Did That Happen? HDTH. Glad to have you guys back for another week. This week, we are talking about the transatlantic slave trade. This is episode number 72. But before we get to that, as always, we have a little bit of housekeeping to get to. I'm going to cover a couple things before we get to this. This is a dense topic, guys. It's going to cover, I think we're covering almost 45 to 50 minutes of this stuff. But we're going to get the beginning, the middle, and the end. We're definitely going to find out how it happened. But as always, like I say, 7 days a week, you can find out how things happen over at htthappen.com. You'll find all the episode transcripts as well as pictures and videos for every episode. There's also a blog over there that's been pretty neglected, hasn't been touched in a few months, but there's definitely some older articles. I'm even thinking about, honestly, maybe even getting into some AI, having some AI articles just write for me in my voice. Why not? I mean, if it works for Drake, right? Which it doesn't, but it still sounds like him. Let's see. What am I watching? What did I watch? What have I seen lately? I'll tell you what I saw. That just blew my mind. I watched Prehistoric Planet on Apple TV. Is it Apple TV Plus? I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's Apple TV Plus. Prehistoric Planet is like Planet Earth or like Blue World, but it's all about dinosaurs. It's all done like if dinosaurs were real. It just follows them around in a way that I feel like has never been done before, in a non-Jurassic Park way, in a archaeology Indiana Jones way, just in a way of if David Attenborough went back 65 million years ago and was just following around these dudes and so this is a dinosaur. He's going into the ocean. Just doing that, but it's but you're watching these great visuals that are computer generated. It was mind blowing. I must honestly say, I went into it not really knowing what it was going to be, trying to just kill some time. And when I tell you I watched the first 3 episodes back to back to back, I was like, this is something I did not know that I needed. So that's what I'm watching. What am I listening to? I'll tell you what, I just tried, and I say tried. I tried listening to that book, American Dirt, which I've had on hold at my local library for a solid 7 months. At the very least amount of time. I've been trying to get a hold of this book for probably about a year and a half, because it's one of those books where everyone's talking about it, everyone loves it. I listened to the first, 20 minutes of it, 25 minutes of it. Didn't love it. Didn't feel like I wanted to give it any more of my time. I didn't, but I tried. To be honest with you, that's what I was listening to. So yeah, nothing great on that front. What I will say, is there anything else I want to say? We are close. I've said it before. We're so close to putting out the newest addition to the How Did That Happen family. Will be coming out here in the next probably weeks and months. Definitely in the next couple weeks. I already have enough to release. Even have the title card has been created. Just got to do a couple more things on the back end before I feel comfortable about putting this out. But the project, of course, is called Conquering Netflix, ConkNet for short. It should be pretty good. We're going to do a seasonal format, so it's going to be 10-episode seasons with a season finale where we crown the best show that has been conquered so far. I hope you guys are going to like it. It's if you like How Did That Happen in any capacity, if you like bite-sized bios in any way, it's just another way to shed a light in a place where I don't think it's where I think it should be. But yeah, I don't know if there's much else to say before we get to it here. As always, give us a like and subscribe wherever you find this, wherever you're hearing this with your ears. If you want to give us 5 stars, that'd be awesome. If you want to give us 2 stars, tell us why you didn't want to give us 5 stars. That's fine as well, because constructive criticism is always welcome. We appreciate it. Every review, always, it helps the pod grow. So definitely give us a like and subscribe wherever you can find this. Let's go ahead and break some old news. All right, so what I've got for you today on Breaking Old News is a little bit different, but not too different. It actually goes in hand with subject matter, which I've been trying to do. Like I said, this segment is only maybe four episodes deep. I'm not even sure at this point. Four or five episodes deep of this breaking old news segment. So I'm still not 100% sure what it is. But I found that when I can find information that kind of goes with the current topic, to me it feels like it goes hand in hand. So what I have for you here is a paper from the Detroit Evening Times, which was published on January 26, 1941, and why it is, I think, pertinent to this specific topic is that it mentions slaves being thrown overboard in a rather aggressive fashion. I looked hard to find the rest of this paper to try to make sure I can get the whole story, but I could not. So if anybody is just for whatever reason hanging on to an old issue of the Detroit Evening Times from 70 years ago, get at your boy. But what we find in this paper is that basically this guy is telling the story of a slave ship, and he says basically the slave ship crew lined up the men and women on the decks with their backs against the bulwarks and fettered men, women, and children to the anchor cables lined along the rails. Get ready, because it doesn't get better from here. Then came the roar of the pursuer's cannon. "Let go both anchors," yelled Captain Mayhem. With dreadful suddenness, there came the clanking of chains, quickly drowned out by a chorus of despairing screams. Like a black cataract, 180 odd slaves were jerked overboard by the loosed anchors and chained to the bottom. After that, silence. So if you missed that and you're not sure what I just said was they just strapped 180 people to an anchor of a ship and threw it overboard. And I just couldn't believe that is so readily available to read. And like I said, that was on one page. They didn't have the other pages of this paper, but I wanted to find it so bad. I looked up Captain Mayhem. There's a Captain Mayhem that existed and definitely was alive during the slave ship times. I found his picture. None of them mentioned him throwing slaves overboard with anchors, but it's like, would that show up on your resume? You wouldn't probably keep that as a shining example of, your positive moralistic actions. I don't know. It was just, I don't want to say the Captain Mayhem that I found was the Captain Mayhem that threw these dudes overboard. I will just say the dude was alive in the 1840s and it doesn't look good. But I mean, man, it's just like this. I may even put a picture of this article, or at least a link to it on the page on the website, because the drawings of it, they're literally drawing these Africans strapped to the anchor in case you couldn't visualize it enough, and they're telling you what it's all about, showing you what it's all about. So what we're here to talk about today is slavery, specifically the transatlantic slave trade. Before we get all the way to that, as you know, if you listen to this podcast, we have to go back before we can go forward. So what I kind of want to do before we get to that is talk about the idea of slavery kind of around the world before it got there. We're going to cover the before, the during, and the after. So definitely we're going to start with slavery in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery during that time was prevalent in many West and Central African societies. Diverse African empires, small to medium-sized nations or kinship groups came into conflict for various political and economic reasons, and individuals from one African group regularly enslaved captives from another because they viewed them as outsiders. That's something that we'll see that happens time and time again before the transatlantic slave trade. The rules of these slaveholding societies could then exert power over these captives as prisoners of war, for labor needs, to expand their kinship group or nation, influence and disseminate spiritual beliefs, yada, 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 stuff like that. Like, it was a real purpose for it that wasn't really based so much in like a kind of a capitalistic viewpoint. And so while some of these nations, these African nations had similar ethnic identities, the concept of a unified black racial identity or of individual freedoms and labor rights were not yet meaningful enough to these people to basically respect them. And this was something that was very much very much a part of the life. They say here, even the elites and the royals from these slaveholding societies, they relied on this sort of like on the way that society worked this way to kind of keep their wealth and status. So I guess I stand corrected as far as that there is a sort of capitalistic sense to it, but not in the same way that we'll see later on. That'll bring us to slavery in the Americas, which this was new to me, because evidently there was, and that's what we'll say. We'll see that in America, and I'm talking about like North America, South America, like the Native Americans before European contact. When I say the Americas, is that, you know, before the arrival of European explorers, diverse American Indian groups lived in a wide range of social structures. Many of these socio-political structures included different forms of slavery or coerced labor. Which one sounds better to you? Based on enslaving prisoners of war between conflicting groups, enforcing slavery within the class of hierarchy of an empire, or forced tribute payments of goods or labor to demonstrate submission to a leader. So just a number of different reasons why they thought slavery was something that should be done. But like I said, I didn't know this. This was all new to me. I never thought about slavery in this context. I had heard that it was in Africa before, like the actual, you know, American transatlantic slave trade that we know that was made famous not too long after this. But I didn't really know that that it was kind of happening, I would say everywhere, but not quite everywhere, as we'll find out. And so the last place that we'll look at as sort of a pre-transatlantic slave trade will be slavery in Europe. And when we're really talking about this, when we say all the pre-times, because I haven't covered the actual timeline that is the transatlantic slave trade. That was during like the 1600s, 1500s, and we're talking about anything before that. We're talking like the 1200s, stuff like that. And so in contrast to the other areas of the world, slavery was not prevalent in Western Europe in the centuries that preceded the transatlantic slave trade. Instead, labor contracts, convict labor, things like serfdom prevailed. And so I think we've talked about serfdom before, I believe, and it was really the idea of like you own or you don't own land, but you work on it for someone else, and you get a portion of, you know, what you do. But obviously the landowner gets a larger amount, which was one of the reasons I think we even talked about in a couple episodes ago was what led people into becoming pirates. That's a kind of jumping the gun. Because of the serfdom in the country, it led for people to then kind of invade the cities looking for work. There not being that much work, people had to find whatever they could to get by, some of those endeavors being piracy. That fully kind of explains what I was saying about how serfdom turns into piracy. I covered that a couple episodes ago, I believe, in the pirate episode. But like I said, it was not very prevalent in the Western European countries and nations at that time. It wasn't always the case. During the Roman Empire and into the early Middle Ages, enslaved Europeans could be found in every region of the subcontinent. But after the Roman Empire collapsed, right around 408 AD, the practice of individual Europeans owning other Europeans as chattel property began to decline. And this is a perfect time to actually just define and describe to you the different types of slavery, because I didn't even know that there were different types of slaves. There are. The slavery that we know was what I just mentioned. It's chattel slavery. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not sure. It looks like chattel. It could be chattel, but chattel. Imagine if it was chattel. That would just sound better than chattel. Chattel sounds bad. Sounds like chatter. I never liked the word chatter. And then there's chattel slavery, and then there's normal slavery, right? And so chattel slavery, in that the slave is legally rendered the personal property, aka chattel, of the slave owner, right? So in economic terms, de facto slavery describes the conditions of unfree labor and forced labor that most slaves endure. As a social institution, chattel slavery classes slaves as chattels, like I said, basically personal property that's owned by the enslaver, like livestock. They can be bought and sold at will. And while this was not present at all times in places in the classical world, chattel slavery did exist in ancient times, and like we said, was practiced in places like the Roman Empire before it was outlawed, basically when the empire fell. So that's kind of when Europe changed into what it would become. Because when you think about it, the transatlantic slave trade is basically perpetuated by Western Europe. They're the ones who are running this whole kind of scheme. And what's crazy, I mean, you see how these last few episodes that we've talked about, we talked about pirates, we talked about and the Wild West, and they both kind of have to do with the idea of, and I'm saying in the last couple episodes of the podcast, and they all have to do with kind of like the creation of the modern world. You know, like they all have to. You can look at, like we talked about, even the reason why there was so much treasure to be found on the seas when pirates were out there, and during the golden age of piracy, was because after the religious wars that Europe fought trying to take Jerusalem and stuff like that, that was their main focus. Once that was over, then they set their focus to colonizing the rest of the world. and going to get what was there and bringing it back to them. And so what they were saying is during that time, there was the majority of the world's wealth was just floating on the ocean. And so it's not rocket science. And some guys would look around and be like, hey, most of the money is just right out here in the water. How about we just kind of see what we can take before it gets back to port? But that's a round the corner way to kind of just bring everything that, if you really follow the last few episodes, it's weird how they all kind of play into each other. But back to chattel slavery. As described in the following sections, the decline of actual chattel slavery occurred due to unique religious and geographic and political circumstances in Western Europe. By 1200, there was no chattel slavery, like I said, left in Europe pretty much at all, except for Southern Europe. So in Southern Europe, they had a long history of having slaves, purchasing slaves from the Eastern Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and Africa. So specifically, we're only talking about Northwestern Europe. I'm not even sure any Southern European countries. I'm not going to lie. I don't know much about the Mediterranean. The food is good. Love those olives. So in Lisbon, for example, African slaves comprised 1/10 of the population in the 1460s. Overall, however, the slave trade in Southern Europe was relatively small compared to what later happened in the New World. Those guys blew it up. And so before the New World expansion, concepts of race and racial hierarchies did not define who could and could not be enslaved in Western Europe. Instead, the spread of Christianity in the early Middle Ages from the 5th to the 10th centuries marked the boundary of slavery throughout Europe. So it really was more of a religious thing than a what you look like sort of thing. And there are people such as historian Brian Davis, who argues that the Judeo-Christian belief in a monotheistic God who rules over a homogeneous people eventually served to prevent European Christians from enslaving one another, kind of, I guess, being like, we both got the same God. How could I say you're my slave? As more Western Europeans converted to Christianity, this unified religious identity enabled a decline in slavery in Europe, but allowed for other rigid social and labor hierarchies to remain, and also for them to start hating the other, because they did not object to the enslavement of non-Christians, particularly with ongoing conflicts between Christians and non-Christians in Europe, in the nearby Islamic world, and later in West and Central Africa, which also included a large amount of Muslim regions. The division really started with the religious Christian Crusades and of the High and Late Middle Ages. That's like I was saying. That's what Europe's main focus was on up until the 1200s, 1100s. Maybe even a little bit further into that. But so that's one of the reasons why they were like, well, Muslim people, they're not Christians, so they can be slaves, or they can be slaves. And also the expansion of Islam in the 15th century through the Ottoman Empire was another reason that the Christians were not that happy, and further would be down to enslave some Muslim people. Now, if you're counting, we have not got to the transatlantic slave trade yet. We are still about 100 to 200 years away. I just kind of wanted to lay the building blocks because I wasn't sure how I was going to start this episode, or really the narrative that I was going to find within it, and I found so much information, but I really didn't. I thought, I don't know. You always think, or I don't want to speak for you, the listener. I always thought that that slavery had always been the same throughout history. That was one of my, theories going in here. Now you find that it just wasn't, and that's why I thought it was important to mention that before we get to what I feel like is much more known, or people more aware of the transatlantic slave trade than I feel like the stuff that I'm talking about right now. So I'm going to kind of run through this, a little bit of the religious stuff, and then we're going to hop actually onto the transatlantic slave train. This I found was wild. It's not completely has to do with slavery, but it does say here that when the Christians did not like basically any of the other religions, and even tried to blame the Black Death on the Jews. I thought that was funny. It's not funny, but it's, I don't know, laughable. I think that's a better way to describe it. And so they're really like the European, and you'll find, and we'll get to this I think a little bit. If we don't, I'm going to go ahead and mention it now. There was a religious, how can I put this? There was religious foundations, or at least the Europeans who colonized America and started the slave trade. They grounded it in their Christian beliefs. The recovery of classical Greek texts before and during the European Renaissance also provided philosophical and theological justification for a Christian social hierarchy that included slavery. So they had this way before they even got to America. For example, Aristotle produced writings about slavery that influenced prominent Christian theologians such as Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and later provided legal and moral justifications for implementing slavery based on a racial hierarchy in the 16th century. So these guys, even though they wrote like 1,500 years ago, this is what those guys who showed up from Europe were kind of like pumping to the masses when they touched ground. Aristotle basically argued that the master and slave relationship was natural, and that some are marked for subjection and others for rule. So he's just like, that's just how the cookie crumbles, my dude. You know, like some of us are slaves, some of us are slave owners. Like, I think it's a real easy thought to have if you're not the slave. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know why nobody was giving this more thought back then. Like, that's not that deep, bro. Like, I feel the same way if I wasn't the slave. And so we get from Aristotle to, like I said, Aquinas, and Aquinas built on Aristotle's claims and ideas and theories, and he asserted that the slave was the physical instrument of his owner, and this condition allowed a slave owner to claim everything his or her slave possessed and produced, including their children. And we'll see that. I mean, that's why there were so many slaves, is because there was money in having them make children. Aquinas also attributed the plight of enslavement to sin and the inevitable conditions of a sinful world. Other theologians before and during the Renaissance emphasized Aristotle's belief in a natural order, but asserted that some men were slaves by their very nature. Kind of just sounds like what Aristotle was saying. And so basically, because of this evolving theology, like I was really saying, when European Christians come across non-Christians, they see them as natural slaves. They see them as like a natural part of like their environment. It's like, oh, well, we're here and we have God, so God gave us slaves, which is such a reach. And so what we'll find, and what they really quoted, and where it really all comes together, and I've heard this before, but I'm really glad that we could actually take this whole narrative and kind of get it from, you know, Aristotle all the way up to this idea of basically the way that they could explain the racial shift in the Judeo-Christian worldview, meaning going from like before it was like we're all about just, because basically they would come to primarily associate Africans with the institution of slavery. That just slowly kind of happened, and I'm not sure if I don't think this actually explains why they saw the Africans like that, but it does explain why they went from, I think, just not seeing slavery as something that they wanted to do, or not something that you wouldn't do to non-Christians, or that you would do to non-Christians, but I'm not sure. I think, but like the idea is the curse of Ham. And according to this interpretation, Africans are the descendants of Ham and Canaan, who Noah cursed into slavery for Ham's transgressions. Ham is Noah's son and Canaan's father. Though the Bible does not mention race or skin color in this narrative, according to these 16th and 17th century theologians, Africans inherited Ham and Canaan's curse of slavery from like day one, right? And so by the 19th century, pro-slavery advocates in the United States continued to use this misleading biblical justification, as well as Aristotle's theory of natural order and New World racial prejudices, to defend their support of slavery. Now, congratulate yourselves. Give yourselves a pat on the back. We got through the beginning. We are now going to move to the actual, wait for it, transatlantic slave trade. Are you ready? So the transatlantic slave trade was the largest long-distance forced movement of people in recorded history. I've got that in bold in my notes because I didn't know that was true. And when you look at it, it's because I myself, I mean, you know, not going to bear the lead. I'm black. I'm African American, and you look at when you really think about it, which I tend to overthink things just on the regular. That there's just so many of what are black people, African American people in this country, and we only got here because of this. I mean, you can argue that a small percentage of the population showed up for other reasons. I'm not, you know, definitely that's totally a thing. But I would say 90% of the domestically born black people probably descend from slaves. And to say it's the largest long distance forced movement of people in recorded history, it's is magnanimous a good word? It's just a monstrous idea to try to undertake. So the global slave trade, it transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from the 16th to 19th century for 366 years, give or take when you start the dates. European slavers loaded approximately 12.5 million Africans onto the Atlantic slave ships. About 11 million survived. I mean, we'll talk about it. I mean, what I didn't realize in the numbers they look at it, that's only the people that got to the coast. Those are only the people that actually made it to the ships, and it's because they're bringing these people from inland Africa, and so people would die. They said millions. I saw a number. I'm not sure if I have it for later. I'll mention it now. This is something like they think 20 million actual Africans were displaced in the transatlantic slave trade, but 8 million of them they think didn't even make it out of the jungle because of either the conditions in which they were obtained or the disease from just already meeting these settlers or whatever. That's just a wild number to me. I never really thought about it. I never knew the 10 to 12 million or whatever, but the fact that they say like almost double that were actually taken, only half of them made that. Portuguese mariners began patrolling the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, primarily in search of gold. In this process, they encountered and either purchased or captured small numbers of Africans. I love that it's like encountered, purchased, or captured, one of them, right, with the first shipload of 235 captives landing in Portugal in 1444. I believe we can probably mark this as the actual date, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Pretty wild. It's like 50 years before Christopher Columbus would even sail the ocean blue. But 235 Africans are brought back from the west coast of Africa to Lagos, Portugal. And so what I'm going to do now is kind of explain to you how, just like, I guess I'll give you like what I can only describe as like an example, one example of how this kind of whole trade went down and the history behind it. So Saharan traders who, starting in the 10th century, introduced horses to sell for gold from the region that was next to the desert. The Africans who bought these horses deployed them to wage wars of a much greater intensity. Kind of like when you see the same thing like when the Indians get horses and like you can't, it makes fighting better. So like they were able to now like fight their enemies in Africa more intensely. And so these conflicts would then escalate. The demand for horses exceeded the supply of gold to pay for them, and the mounts were used to capture Africans to sell as slaves to buy more horses. Let me say that again. So as the conflicts escalated, the demand for horses exceeded the supply of gold to pay for them, and the mounts were used to capture Africans to sell as slaves to buy more horses. These captives were destined for markets in North Africa, but along the way, the desert traders diverted some of their human cargo to Portuguese buyers. What I'm kind of telling you right now is how we get the very first slaves that enter the transatlantic slave trade. These African traders, like I said, they sell them to established Iberian markets, which was how the first cargo of enslaved people came to be sold at Lagos, Portugal, as you mentioned, 1444. The death of King Henry in Portugal, 1580, led to a dynastic union with Spain, and the Portuguese in West Africa became Spanish subjects, with the authority to trade in Spain's American markets. Spain, as we mentioned in multiple of our previous podcasts, had a very large hand in really conquering North America. And so by this time, like I said, we got the death of King Henry of Portugal in 1580. The chaos in Congo had produced thousands of refugees who were easily captured for dispatch in the Spanish Indies. What we have here is we get the horses, like 1,000 years ago, right? Horses make battle. People love the horses. Can't get enough of the horses. They trade the horse mounts for people. The people get sold to Portugal. Portugal gets kind of taken over by Spain. Spain takes those slaves that they got from Portugal in West Africa, takes them to the Indies. We're talking the Caribbean, basically where Christopher Columbus showed up. And so the cost of buying these desperately vulnerable Americans was so low, European investors were able to make a quick profit selling these captives in America for Spanish silver. And now what I'm about to kind of explain to you is how the first actual slaves showed up in America. I feel like this is something that wasn't quite explained. I feel like even when you read or watch the 1619 Project, I don't know if it's, I've watched bits and pieces, so maybe I missed it, but like the Dutch and English privateers, neither of them friends of Spain or Portugal, preyed on the ships that were transporting these captive Africans. Right, so they were like, we don't like these dudes. Right, we're gonna try to take what we can off their ships. And when they do that, In 1619, two of them, the White Lion and the Treasurer, they attacked the Portuguese ship São João Bautista. I'm doing my best here. And they robbed it of its cargo, about 50 enslaved Africans. A few months later, the White Lion arrived in Virginia carrying 20 and odd survivors. And these were the first Africans of the new colony. Now, when I've always heard this story, not this quite story, but I've heard versions of this, I always had in my mind, this is how I had it in my mind, I'll tell you. I saw it as British people, right, went to Africa, took African people, brought them back over to America. That's what I thought how the first African slaves got to America. That is not. Like we just said, they were taken. Just an interesting little caveat I feel like it's necessary to put in here. The first slaves were actually taken from Portugal and brought to America by the English and Dutch. And that's just a little example, I think, that really kind of just gives you the idea of because there's so many parts. You know what I mean? People don't just show up on the beach and start being like, all right, give me your people. Let me get that guy. I want this one. The short one. Give me him. They don't do that. Or I mean, they probably got to that. But that's not the first meeting. What you have is like most things. I mean, it's like a lot of things break down to economics. It's a supply and demand. It starts with the horses. It starts with the introduction of horses 1,000 years ago into West and Northwest Africa. So the next part of this that we'll talk about is we kind of covered a little bit of it in the pirate episode. Is that one of the reasons why pirates were so successful and why there was so much cargo on the road or on the ocean, on the sea? Try to get it down right here. Was because of what's called triangular trade. And so what they would have basically is there were three destinations. Like I said, this was the reason why the European nations lost so much cargo is because they just left it. When you're doing that, you're getting greedy, kind of. I think is really what it is. If you do a straight shot, back from one place to another, it's quicker. There's less time you're on the sea, less chance of getting taken over by pirates. But they would basically go from Europe to Africa to the Americas back to Europe, right? So the European slave traders and colonizers, they are going from Europe to Africa, and they're picking up people to then sell back in the Americas, because the Americas are making goods and products. They're taking the products that are made because they're under the crowns of whatever European nation is handling whatever part of America at that time, and they take those goods back to Europe, and that is how America kind of runs for like 300 years. That is the way that we get things done. That's the way that money gets handled. That's the way that money changes hands. And so this so-called triangular trade subsequently developed between Europe, Africa, and the Americans. It was in fact a complex series of separate trades, sometimes spread over several vessels, sailing on each of its three legs. And so like I said, on the first leg, you get manufactured goods from Europe. They were transported for sale or trade in Africa. These goods included wine and spirits, various metals such as iron and copper, ammunition and cheap muskets. They eventually stopped giving them muskets because they wanted to keep taking the people, so let's stop giving them guns. And on the second leg, they would take the goods were replaced with human cargo on their way to America, where they'd be sold to European colonies to produce sugar, tobacco, and cotton and other raw materials. The third leg would see those same materials come back to Europe as their final part of the trip. All right, so just a little bit more about those Portuguese, and then we're going to get on to like the actual idea of getting the slaves, put them on the ship. What was that like? I just want to tell you a little bit more about like the very beginning of, because I didn't know it's the Portuguese who really kicked all this off. I feel like I've heard that before. Like people have told me that. I feel like the Portuguese kicked it off, and the Dutch did the most. If we're gonna sit here and try to figure out, who wins the Slave Olympics or whatever, it's definitely the Dutch with a gold, and the Portuguese with a silver, I think. But so the Portuguese, they show up in 1444, like we mentioned, looking to get some people. They want some people. They're gonna take them. They showed up in Senegal. They're ready to fight these guys with armors, swords, and deep sea vessels. But when they get there, they realize that the Senegalese have outmaneuvered their ships because they have a lot smaller vessels that are better suited for the estuaries that are around the whole coast of Senegal. And so they also fought them with poison arrows that like just chop these dudes out, man. Like they would just hit them and they'd be done. So because of that, kind of like what we were mentioning earlier, the Portuguese developed a trading relationship with the Kingdom of Congo throughout pretty much the entire transatlantic slave trade from like 1400s to like the 1900s, like the 1800s. But it was because of this civil war with Congo that a lot of, or the civil war within the Congo that they had the trading relation with, this is where a lot of the actual slaves came from during the early part of the transatlantic slave trade. And so what actually would end up happening is, of course, the Portuguese and other European countries realize that they get more out of countries that are, or nations or tribes that are at war than if they're peaceful. It's like a light bulb went off in their head. And so they realized that, peaceful relations alone could not generate enough enslaved Africans to fill the growing demands of the slave trade. So they formed military alliances and kind of started fighting these proxy wars. They formed a military alliance with certain African groups against their enemies. And this encouraged more extensive warfare to produce captives. Like we said, they're kind of where it all kind of comes from is the idea that, these guys fight, they capture slaves, or they capture their enemy and sell him to the Europeans. And so they need war to make prisoners of war. So they're basically just stirring up mess. They're just being messy in Africa to make people slaves. I'm trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to mention about this part before we get on to the actual the idea of getting these slaves. Let's see. Like I said, the Dutch were the ones who really kind of took the cake as far as being the bad boys of the slave trade. The English and French kind of came in after that and owned about half of the slave trade, took most of their slaves from West Africa and the Niger rivers. Like I said, this happened for more than just the English, actually, they say as well. Since the Portuguese were the first people to really start the slave trade, most European competitors got their first slaves by taking them from Portuguese ships. So it seems that a lot of European nations were just like, let's rob those Portuguese. They seem to got it. They seem to have a pretty good idea here going. So let's see. We have a few numbers here to start. By the end of the 19th century, there were more than 4 million African slaves in Brazil. Northern European powers soon followed the same plan that Portugal and Spain had kind of put into play. British slave traders alone transported like 3.5 million Africans to the Americas. And so it's interesting, when we do say transatlantic slave trade, I think also my thoughts are all these slaves went straight from Africa to America. They really didn't. As we're seeing here, they went to South America. They went to the Caribbean. And then some of them went to the actual North American continent. Okay, so now I said we've talked about a lot. We've covered a lot. So once again, pat yourself on the back. We just covered another leg of this. I don't know if it's triangular. It's probably more like a square. A few different legs or parts to it. I'm not going to overthink it. But now we are at the part of the procurement of the slaves. I'm going to take you through people's depictions of slave ships. Just kind of that whole song and dance. So like I mentioned earlier, roughly 20 million people were taken from their homes and sold into slavery during the 350 some odd years of the transatlantic slave trade. Almost half of them didn't complete the journey to the African coast. Most of those people died along the way. There was actually a book that was written, and I'll quote from this guy a couple times. I might actually try to find the book at some point, but his name was Olaudah Equino, sure. And he was abducted when he was 8, and he describes it. I'll tell you. I'll quote what he says and kind of get an idea firsthand. He says, "One day, when all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could until night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep, end quote. I mean, that's literally his depiction of being taken from his home and just the beginning journey of becoming a slave. So following capture, the abducted Africans were marched to the coast, a journey that could be as many as 300 miles, 485 kilometers. Typically, 2 captives were chained together at the ankle, and columns of captives were tied together by ropes around their necks. And this is a different percentage, but they say an estimated 10 to 15% of the captives died on their way to the coast. I feel like it was more, 300 miles. You had to walk 300 miles. Most people ain't gonna make that. They're just, especially if you're not being fed and getting the right rest. Like, I don't know. You would think in an effort to like ensure their profit, they would have, like, I don't know, put them on a dolly or something. I don't know. And so the slave trade had a just devastating effect on Africa. The economic incentives for warlords and tribes to engage in the trade of enslaved people promoted an atmosphere of just lawlessness and just violence. Depopulation and continuing fear of captivity made economic and agricultural development almost impossible throughout much of Western Africa. So not a lot's getting done because everybody's like fighting because they're mad at each other and afraid they're going to get taken out of their backyard like old Olaudah did. A large percentage of the people that were taken captive were women in their childbearing years and young men who normally would have been starting families. So basically, you're losing all of like the main people who are doing stuff. You're losing all the people who are going to have kids, the people who are going to work these jobs. So like the infrastructure of these African nations just implodes. So the European enslavers usually left behind people who were like elderly, disabled, or otherwise dependent of like groups who were like least able to contribute to the economic health of their society. So they were just, all you got around you is you have no strong, able-bodied people. You have some disabled people and some old people. You can't always do, everything with that. And so once they got to the coast, then they get on the ships, they were typically chained together, and usually because the low ceilings of the ships did not permit them to sit upright, they had to kind of lay down. The heat was intolerable, and the oxygen levels were so low that candles couldn't even burn. I thought that's a crazy fact. Think about that for a second. Think about how bad it must have been in the hull of those ships that the oxygen was so low that fire couldn't even exist. Fire loves oxygen, and it couldn't even light a candle. So because the crews of these slave ships feared insurrection, the Africans were allowed to go outside on the upper decks only for a few hours each day. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americans died aboard the slave ships. So, I mean, I guess if you put that together with the 10 to 15 that died coming to the coast and the other 15 to 25% that died on the ships, that does kind of come up to almost half. Would explain, kind of how we go from 20 million to 10 to 12. And the next thing that we'll talk about is called, or I think it still is because it's still around, is the Elmina Castle. Now this was pretty interesting to me because this place, it's in Africa. It was built by the Portuguese in 1482. It was one of the main areas. It was one of the main trading posts, slave trading posts throughout the entire transatlantic slave trade. So there's a large amount of slaves who would end up coming to America, ended up going through this place. Like I said, it's called the Elmina Castle, or sometimes known as the Castelo de São Jorge da Mina, which is the St. George of the Mine Castle. It's in Ghana. And like I said, it was the first trading post built on the Gulf of Guinea and the oldest European building in existence south of the Sahara. And so after the 17th century, most trade in Western Africa concentrated on the sale of slaves. So the old Elmina played a significant part in the West African slave trade. The castle acted as a depot where enslaved Africans were brought in from different kingdoms in West Africa and kind of held there until they would be shipped out on these ships on the coast. And the Africans, often captured in the African interior by the slave catchers of coastal peoples, were sold to Portuguese and later to Dutch traders in exchange for goods such as textiles and, of course, the horses. But that's what I think is, like I said, I'll go back to the last paragraph before what I just said. They were brought in from multiple different kingdoms in West Africa. So this was the place where they all came together and, were then kind of dispersed throughout the new world from this castle. I thought it was interesting because it's still around. It still stands today. It's a 500, almost 50-year-old building. Like I said, the oldest European building in America south of the Sahara. The pictures will definitely be on the website. It's just it's interesting to look at. I have a little bit about the actual building of it, but I don't know, for whatever reason I thought that was interesting when I put it in here, but I don't know if it's even worth mentioning right now. I'll give you the cliff notes of it. Portuguese met with the local chief Kwame Anza. They told the chief of great advantages in building a fort, including the protection from the very powerful king of Portugal. During this meeting, they had a massive peace ritual that included a feast, musicians, and many participants, both Portuguese and native. The chief did not want a permanent settlement because he was weary of the European settlers and what they were probably going to try to do. However, with firm plans already in place, the Portuguese would not be deterred. After offering gifts, making promises, and hinting at the consequences of noncompliance, aka, if you don't do what we are suggesting, things could get worse. They got an agreement from the actual chief who kind of owned the land that Elmina Castle is on. And they actually had to demolish the homes of some of the villagers, like I said, who was on that land. They would then build the huge castle on. It also says, I think they're here, so that the rock that they would use for the castle, there was a rock quarry not too far away. But the native people of Ghana, they thought that rock quarry was the home of one of their gods in the nearby River Benya. And so when the Portuguese went over there to start construction and start breaking up rocks, then they lost their mind. But the Portuguese had actually sent gifts to kind of say, hey, we're about to do this, don't get so mad. But the gifts didn't show up until after the construction started. Everybody was mad. The natives go off, kill a bunch of Portuguese. They eventually come to some sort of agreement, but basically because while they agreed, but they never really fully agreed, the Portuguese still burnt the rest of the village down in retaliation for everything that happened. But I just thought that was a little bit interesting about just, for something, a building that I think I should be in history books. I mean, like 8th grade history books. I feel like it's not. And so we're going to get to the slave. I thought this was interesting. It was just the slave ships I thought was interesting. There's a bunch of different names. And I'm just going to mention a couple of them before we get to the next part. There's not too much more left, I think, to get to, because we've basically covered the trade itself. We started all the way before. We've gotten to the during. Definitely have a little bit about the after. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. But of course, we always know there'll be stuff on the mini episode because I am just, this stuff. There's so much information that I'm just scrolling through right now, trying to make this somewhat palatable. So there's a couple different names of slave ships. The Amistad, La Amistad, of course, that was a famous slave ship because they actually the slaves on that ship kind of fought back and they had a mutiny and they took over the ship, brought it into port, ended up being rearrested and then acquitted of the charges because they were actually brought here illegally. Whole thing, it's a movie. I actually watched about the first 45 minutes of it here recently, kind of to get ready for this. Pretty good. It's old. I mean, not old, but 25, 30 years old. So I was wondering what would it be like if they made it now. I feel like there'd be a lot less. I don't know. Check it out though. There's a ship called the Hannibal, Takora, Marie Serafinique. Pretty cool name. Mirman, Jesus of Lubeck. Can you imagine being on a slave ship named Jesus? There was one called the French Corvette. Prince has his little red Corvette. The slave owners have their French Corvette. And the wildest one, I think I've already said the name, but the wildest one, the story I think is about the Clotilda. Clotilda. It's a pretty aggressive name, first off, but there's a documentary on Netflix. I think I may have mentioned it before. I'm not 100% sure. I think on the What Am I Watching segment, possibly in the past. It's called, I believe it's called The Descendants, or just Descendants. But it is about the last slave ship that transported slaves from Africa to America. And the name of that ship was the Clotilda. And there's a lot of history behind it. It was basically missing for the last 150 years. They recently just found it. And it was there's a lot more to it. I would definitely recommend watching that documentary. You find out that the family that owned the slave ship that brought the people in all those years ago is still doing very well and has kind of transformed their slave profits into something else, which is just whatever the legal business is now. But that was definitely, check that out. Let's see here. There's not too much more I wanted to get across. Talked about the slave ships. We talked about the slave castles. Talked about procuring the slaves. And I myself just had questions that I kind of bolded out, and was just asking myself things like, so I could kind of get the research going. Things like, how long was the voyage? How long was the voyage? The voyage in the Middle Passage was about 80 days. To put that in perspective, and this actually really did it for me. It's the time basically from like mid-October to New Year's. It's like the holidays in the winter. It's how long it took for the Middle Passage. So imagine being locked in the hull of a ship from mid-October all the way to New Year's Eve. I mean, that just sounds horrific. Then I have, let's see, famous buildings that were built by slave labor, because I asked myself, what are famous buildings that were built by slave labor? What they do when they got here? What did those slaves slave away on? I got a couple places for you. The White House was built by slave labor. The Capitol Building, also built by slave labor. Georgetown University, also slave labor. UNC Chapel Hill, the Smithsonian. Basically, a lot of D.C. What I didn't know, and this is pretty wild, I found out basically Wall Street was also built by slaves, but not, I don't think specifically the building of Wall Street, but the wall that the street itself is named after. So the very name Wall Street is born from slavery, with enslaved Africans building a wall in 1653 to protect Dutch settlers from Indian raids. So the wall in Wall Street was made to protect people from Indian raids, and it was made by slaves. This walkway and wooden fence made of pointed logs and running river to river later was known as Wall Street, which would become the home of finance, the world of finance. You just never know. You just never know. And I think the last thing that I have to share with you before we get out of here, because basically the slavery, let me get these numbers right. So the transatlantic slave trade officially ended in 1807. The British stopped, they abolished it in 1807. The U.S. was supposedly stopped it the very next year. But I mean, really, it was just, abolished on the books. It would continue to go on for about the next 50 years. And even, like I said, the Clotilda, which was the last slave ship to bring slaves to America, did so in like 1860. So it was very much still a large part of the American economy right up until the Civil War. So that is pretty much the end of the transatlantic slave trade itself, as far as like, when it ended. We know when it started. We know what happened in the middle. The last thing that I have to really tell you guys is kind of what happened after. Now, I never knew really, I never thought about it. Let's put it that way. I never thought about what happened after the transatlantic slave trade, after slavery, because you always think about slaves were free, yada, 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 Juneteenth, Reconstruction, civil rights, all that good stuff. That's for one specific like color or race of people. Later on, I would learn about what is called blackbirding. And blackbirding is the coercion of people through deception or kidnapping to work as slaves or poorly paid laborers in countries distant from their native land. That's blackbirding. I'd never heard the term before, literally until like a week ago. Blackbirding. So this practice took place on a large scale, with the taking of people the indigenous people from numerous islands in the Pacific Ocean during the 19th and 20th century. So basically, once the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed, once they were like, y'all can't go to Africa no more, to get people to bring them back to America or to other countries, either South America or whatever, the powers that be then started just plundering and pillaging these small Pacific island nations and taking people from there and using them as slaves. And people were taken from places even such as Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the Easter Islands, Gilbert Islands, Fiji, all these different places. And so the owners and captains and even the crews of these ships involved in the acquisition of these laborers, they were termed blackbirders. They were called blackbirders. And so the demand for this cheap labor really came from the European colonists in places like New South Wales, Samoa, Queensland, Guatemala, Peru, And I've always wondered when I found this out, it made so much sense because when you watch, I don't know, like depending on where you are in the world, it dictates what the lower level, like labor like type people look like. And here in America, it's usually a lot of black people, Hispanic people, even some Asian people, but not as much. But when you look in like Australia, South of Africa, places like that, the main laboring population does seem to be Pacific Islanders. There does seem to be Asian of some sort, and I can never figure out where that connection came from. And come to find out, this is what the colonists were on once they stopped importing Africans into America, into the Americas. They switched and started grabbing up these Asian people and bringing them to their new colony. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there's another part. I mean, there's more. I have kind of an in-depth layout of what happened to specific tribes during this blackbirding, but I'm not sure if it's necessary to even read now. I might run through it real fast. I mean, the main thing that I'm talking about is what's called the Kanaka trade in the 1870s. And this was when they were recruiting South Sea Islanders to work in these industries aboard labor vessels that were crossing eastern Australia, and they obtained these Kanakas to go to Queensland and Fiji, like I was saying. Captains of these ships would get paid about 5 shillings per recruit in head money incentives, while the owners of the ships would sell the Kanakas from anywhere between 4 pounds to 20 pounds per head. Now, this is all after the transatlantic slave trade. This is after it's been basically abolished, ruled illegal almost 100 years ago. And the last slave ship to come from Africa has already been and gone. But they have now changed to this blackbirding stuff. And so, I mean, there's not much more to really even say, I think, about it without just getting too far in depth with something that I don't think is the full focus of this podcast. But I will say there is an after, which is something that I did not know. There's an after to the transatlantic slave trade. It kept on going. As they say, slavery is still alive and well now. Unfortunately, slavery is still being done by a number of different countries and regions all across the world. All right, that was another episode of How Did That Happen? It was episode number 72. We are chugging right along on the way to 100, guys, hoping to get there. I mean, at this point, due to the new format of the show, episode 100 probably won't happen until next year, probably 2024. But we're definitely on the way. Hope you guys enjoyed that. If you haven't noticed, the subject matter is going to keep getting a little bit more serious, a little bit more long form. That was always the entire goal of this podcast, was to have a more in-depth and long form discussion about topics that I don't feel like always get covered, or I feel like could be covered in a more, a more in-depth way. So I hope you guys are liking the changes that are coming with it. Like I said, we got more shows coming down the pike. Conquering Netflix will be coming out pretty soon, sooner than later. I am closer to releasing that than I ever have been. I always appreciate you guys for pressing play, coming back week to week, all the ones that do. Like and subscribe wherever you hear this, wherever you're taking this in with your ears. Give us 5 stars if you could, 2 stars if you didn't want to. Tell us why you didn't want to give us 5 stars, because constructive criticism is always welcome. As always, guys, thank you for pressing play. Coming back week to week. We'll see you next week with the next bite-sized bio.